I'm Jack, retired now, but I was an engineer for nearly 40 years. I built bridges, buildings, and systems that held the weight of hundreds of people's lives. I didn't just design them. I made sure they were solid. No weak spots, no cracks, no room for failure. I guess you could say I lived my life like that, too. Steady, reliable. I married Barbara 15 years ago, and I thought our relationship was just as solid. After all, it had been built on mutual respect, shared values, and, above all, trust. We didn't have a perfect marriage, but it was good. I'm a simple man, always have been. Never too many frills. We had our routines, family dinners, Saturday afternoons in the yard, the occasional trip to see the kids or visit old friends. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. But it worked for us. We were content. That's the thing people don't get about long marriages. They don't have to be exciting all the time to be meaningful. There's a certain peace in just knowing that the person you're with has your back. And, for the most part, I thought Barbara had mine. She was always the more outgoing one. People liked her. She had this way of making friends everywhere she went, at church, at the store, in the neighborhood. Barbara had this warmth about her that drew people in. I was never the life of the party, but I didn't mind. I was happy to let her take the spotlight. We complimented each other. At least that's how I saw it. She was the heart of our home, always planning things, organizing the family schedule, handling the day-to-day. As for me, well, I did the grunt work. I was the one fixing things around the house, taking care of the car, mowing the lawn, little things that mattered to her, keeping the house in good shape, keeping things running smoothly. I didn't mind, not at all. In fact, I preferred it that way. I always believed in hard work, and for a long time, that was enough. But as I said, things started to change. It was gradual at first, almost imperceptible. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been paying attention. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but there were little things, small things that didn't seem right. It started when she joined this personal development group about 6 months ago. She'd always been a little into self-improvement, but this new group seemed to take up more and more of her time. At first, I didn't think much of it. She told me it was something to help her get back to herself, and honestly, I didn't mind. She deserved to have her own hobbies and interests. We all need that, right? But over time, the hours spent away from home started to add up. She'd tell me about these workshops she was attending, sometimes on weekdays, sometimes over the weekend. And when she got home, she'd talk about it like it was this life-changing experience. I didn't say much. I didn't want to be that husband who stifled her interests. I'd heard her out, made the occasional joke about it, and let it go. But then it started to feel like I was losing touch with her. I couldn't quite place it, but something in her tone had changed. There was a distance I couldn't ignore. It wasn't like she was angry or upset with me. She was just different, a little distracted, maybe more distant. One evening, I came home from the garage to find her sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in hand, her eyes darting away from mine when I walked in. "Everything okay?" I asked, thinking maybe she was just stressed from work or the group. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if it was a rehearsed answer. "Oh yeah, fine. Just a few things I need to take care of. I'm gonna be out tomorrow night with Julie." Julie was one of her friends, someone I'd met a few times at family gatherings. We'd shared a laugh over dinner once or twice, but Julie wasn't someone I would have called a close friend of mine. She'd been a part of Barbara's circle, but I didn't think much of it. Still, Barbara's sudden enthusiasm for seeing her seemed a little out of place. "Out tomorrow night?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. We hadn't had a dinner together in a while, just the two of us. I felt like I was losing touch with that part of our life. She didn't seem to notice. "Yeah," she replied, too casually. "It's just a girls' night, you know. Nothing big. I'll be home late." Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, but I didn't press the issue. I never did. If I had to guess, I'd say I wasn't even looking for signs. Maybe I was being naive. I trusted her. It wasn't until a few days later that I noticed something I couldn't ignore. I was putting away some laundry when I found a folded ticket in one of her coat pockets. At first, I thought it was just a concert ticket or some trivial thing she'd picked up. But then I saw the date, this Friday night. It was a ticket for a dinner cruise, something I had never heard of before. A fancy one, too. The kind of thing we might have done on an anniversary or special occasion, but never on a random Friday. I felt a sudden lump in my throat. This wasn't something she had mentioned to me. I'm not the type to assume the worst, but this felt different. She'd said she was meeting Julie, right? And yet, here was this ticket for something far more extravagant than what she described. I didn't ask her about it right away. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions. But it kept gnawing at me, eating at me when I tried to sleep. Who was she going with? And why hadn't she mentioned this to me? I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started looking for more clues. Not in an obsessive way, but just enough to connect the dots. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. I wasn't prying into her privacy for no reason. I was simply noticing patterns that didn't make sense. I wasn't expecting to find much, but I began to notice other things. One night, I was in the living room watching TV when I heard her in the other room, talking to someone on the phone. I didn't recognize the voice. It was low, a little too intimate for my liking. And when she saw me standing there, her eyes widened, and she quickly ended the conversation. Who was that? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral, not wanting to come off as accusatory. Oh, just a colleague, she said, walking past me. We were talking about some work stuff. I didn't question her further. It didn't seem like the time, but my mind kept turning over the facts, the ticket, the phone call, the late nights. I wasn't some paranoid fool. This was adding up to something I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I was going to find out. Barbara always said that when you trust someone, you don't need to check their phone or spy on their messages. And I never had. But now, I had no choice. If she was being truthful, there'd be nothing to hide. So I started paying closer attention. I watched the phone a little more closely. I noticed the way she'd get a text and immediately close the screen, like she didn't want me to see. And when I'd ask her about her day, she'd give me short answers. Nothing like the open conversations we used to have. The truth was, I didn't want to know. I didn't want to see the cracks in our marriage. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that maybe those cracks had been there all along. And soon, I was going to find out just how deep they ran. It wasn't until one evening, when I was putting the trash out, that I found it. A receipt, one that I wasn't meant to see. And on that receipt, a hotel booking for the same weekend Barbara had said she was away with her friend Julie. My heart sank as I looked at the dates. My mind raced as I thought about who could have been with her. I knew I had to face the truth. I had to know what was really going on. It wasn't just a receipt that made my stomach drop. It was the weight of the realization that I was standing at the edge of something I hadn't wanted to believe. Something had been building, slowly, methodically, under the surface of our marriage. And now I could no longer ignore it. The ticket, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, and now this hotel receipt. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was a pattern. I stood there, holding that flimsy piece of paper, my mind racing. The dates matched up with the trip she'd planned with her friend Julie, the one she'd said was going to keep her busy for the weekend. I told myself it was nothing, just a girl's weekend away, some harmless fun. But now I wasn't so sure. The receipt was from a hotel I didn't recognize, in a part of town I didn't think she had any reason to visit. But the biggest red flag of all? The hotel was listed as a romantic getaway. The kind of place you book for special occasions, not for a casual girls' weekend. I stood frozen for a few minutes, the cold air around me sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed it. My thoughts were elsewhere. On her, on everything I thought I knew, on how much I had been wrong. I didn't know what to do with the receipt. I wanted to confront her right there and then, but I knew that wasn't the right move. I had to think this through. I had to be sure. This wasn't something you could just accuse someone of without proof, without knowing how deep the betrayal went. I decided to play it cool. I'd act like everything was fine, like I hadn't discovered anything. I had to keep my distance, but I couldn't let her know I was onto her. I wasn't going to give her a chance to come up with more lies, to deflect, to cover up what I now knew was the truth. The next few days passed in a haze. I stayed quiet, watching her closely without letting on that anything had changed. Barbara was her usual self, busy with work, talking about the book club and the yoga classes she was taking. I didn't ask her about the weekend trip again, and she didn't bring it up, but I could feel the tension between us. It was like an invisible thread was pulling tighter every time we shared a moment, and I could tell she felt it too. It was on the Thursday evening before her planned trip when I finally made up my mind. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront her. My curiosity was eating me alive, and deep down, I knew I had a right to know what was really going on. I also knew I couldn't let her twist this into something she could explain away. This wasn't about trust anymore. This was about truth. "Barbara," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table, trying to keep my voice steady. She was in the other room, putting away her purse. I could hear the soft clink of her keys as she did so. "Yeah," she called back, her voice light and pleasant, the way she always sounded when she didn't think anything was wrong. "Can we talk?" I asked. My tone was even, but I could feel the heaviness in the air. It wasn't the same as all the other times we'd had a casual conversation. I think she could sense it too. There was something different in my voice. She walked into the kitchen and looked at me, that familiar smile on her face, the one she used when she wanted to calm me down. "Sure, what's up?" I placed the hotel receipt on the table. I didn't say anything at first, just let it sit there between us. Her eyes immediately went to it, and I watched as the smile slowly faded from her face. She didn't even try to hide her reaction, and that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She looked guilty, almost caught. I waited, but she said nothing. I had my answer before she even spoke. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low, controlled. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't accusing. I just needed to hear it from her, needed to see how she was going to spin it. "Jack, she started, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, Barbara was speechless. "I don't understand," I said, leaning back in my chair, watching her carefully. "You said you were going away with Julie. But this?" I pointed to the receipt. "This doesn't look like a girl's weekend." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a long, painful moment, she just stood there, looking at the receipt. The silence between us was heavy, thick with the unspoken truth. "I wasn't lying," she finally said, her voice almost too soft to hear. "I was with Julie. We went upstate. But it wasn't just us." That was the first time she'd said anything even remotely truthful. I wanted to press her for more, to make her say it, but I held back. I had to hear it all from her, without me pushing her too hard. She hesitated, then looked away, her hands wringing together. "Jack, I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to hurt you." "Who was it?" I asked, my voice suddenly growing firmer. "Who were you with?" Barbara's face reddened, and I saw the tear welling in her eye. But I couldn't pity her. Not yet. Not when she was the one who'd betrayed me. "I wasn't with Julie," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I was with him." I blinked, waiting for her to explain, but she didn't. I knew she didn't have to say it. I could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the shame. She was hiding it all behind a mask of sorrow. But I wasn't fooled. "Who?" I pressed again, now feeling the anger bubble up inside of me. "Who is him?" It's someone from the group I've been seeing. I didn't want to hurt you, Jack. But it's been happening for a while now. I've been seeing him on and off for months." She wiped her eyes, as though the tears might make me soften, might make me forget what she had just confessed. My mind was reeling, but I held it together. "So, all this time while I've been working, while I've been home, what was I to you? What was this?" I motioned between us. The years we'd spent together, the life we'd built. Was it all just a lie? Barbara opened her mouth to speak, but the words were stuck. The tears were streaming down her face now. "I don't know what to say, Jack," she said, choking on her words. "I don't know how to make this right." I stood up then, shaking my head. I felt numb, like I was detached from everything. This wasn't my wife. This wasn't the woman I'd married, the woman who'd told me I was her everything. This was someone else entirely. I looked at her one last time, feeling a surge of disgust rise in my chest. She wasn't even trying to explain herself anymore, wasn't trying to justify the lies. She knew it was over. She had to know. "I don't think there's anything left to say," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. The truth was now out there in the open, and I wasn't about to let her twist it. Not this time. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't look at it immediately, but when I did, the message that greeted me made my blood run cold. It was from an unknown number, and it said simply, "I saw her with him last night. The same hotel. I think you should know." The silence after Barbara's confession hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating everything between us. I'd known something was off for weeks, But hearing her finally admit to the affair, hearing her say those words aloud, it was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't process it at first. It was as though everything I had known about her, everything I'd built with her, had crumbled in the span of a few seconds. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I kept it contained. For now anyway. I stood there, staring at her, my mind 1,000 miles away. I'd asked the question I needed an answer to. I had the truth, and now there was nothing left to say. I wasn't even angry at her yet, not in the way I knew I would be. Right now, all I felt was sadness. It was the kind of sadness that comes when you realize you don't really know the person you've spent your life with. The woman who had promised to be my partner through thick and thin had just shattered that promise. And for what? A man who didn't even matter? A few stolen moments of excitement? Her eyes followed me as I walked away from the table, but she didn't say anything. She knew I was done with the conversation. There was nothing more to discuss, nothing left for her to explain. She was a stranger to me now. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I went into the living room, sat on the couch, and stared at the TV, though I wasn't watching it. My mind was elsewhere. I tried to gather my thoughts. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that Barbara, the woman I'd trusted, the one I'd been loyal to for over a decade, had betrayed me like this. My hand clenched into a fist, the anger simmering beneath the surface. But I was cold and calculated. I couldn't just let this go. She thought this was over because she'd confessed, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. If she thought I was going to forgive her because she came clean, she had another thing coming. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words and a couple of tears. I knew how these things worked. She'd be sorry now, but that wouldn't mean anything in the long run. She'd probably cry, beg for forgiveness, and promise to change, but I wasn't buying it. I knew how these women operated. The first time she told me the truth was the last. There was no coming back from this. Jack! Her voice interrupted my thoughts. It was soft, almost pleading. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I didn't want to hurt you, she continued, her voice cracking. I was confused. I turned to face her then. The look in her eyes was not one of remorse. It was fear. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was looking for a way out. But I wasn't going to let her have it. You thought, I said, my voice low and measured. You thought this would be some sort of little adventure? Some little secret to spice up your life? Well, guess what? It's not. This isn't just a mistake, Barbara. This is betrayal. You've broken everything. I don't care if you're sorry now. It's too late for that. I could see her trying to form words, but she wasn't getting very far. There was no defense she could make. There was no excuse that could cover up what she'd done. Her entire world was crumbling in front of her, and I wasn't going to soften the blow. I wasn't going to make it easier for her. I'm sorry, Jack. I never meant for it to happen, she said, her hands shaking now. But I need you. I need us to work through this. We've been together so long. Stop. I cut her off. Just stop. You think I'm going to fix this with you? With someone who's been sleeping with another man behind my back? What is it you want me to do? Hug you? Tell you it's okay? That this is something we can just work through? No. This is done. I could see the panic rise in her. She had never been this vulnerable with me before, not like this. I knew her well enough to see the cracks starting to show. She'd always been the strong one, the one who had the answers. Now, she was desperate. She was trying to salvage something that was beyond saving. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I wanted her to understand the finality of this moment, the weight of my words. You don't get to ask for forgiveness, I said. You don't get to fix this. It's over, Barbara. Her lips quivered as she started to speak, but the words weren't coming out anymore. She was on the verge of losing it completely. She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, putting distance between us. She choked on her words. I don't know what to do. I'll do anything, Jack. Anything to make this right. But it was too late. She'd already made her choice. And now I was going to make mine. The days that followed were strange. The house, once a place of warmth, had turned cold. I couldn't look at Barbara without feeling a deep sense of disgust. It wasn't just that she'd cheated. It was the fact that she had taken everything we had and thrown it away without a second thought. All those years of our lives together, everything we'd built, gone in an instant. She tried to make amends, of course. She begged me to go to therapy with her. She tried to arrange weekend getaways to rekindle the spark. But I wasn't interested in pretending. I couldn't look at her the same way. Every time she tried to touch me or speak to me, I felt repulsed. I'd already made my decision. I wasn't going to forgive her. And I wasn't going to let this slide without consequences. It was time for me to take action, not just for my own peace of mind, but because I knew I had to show her the weight of her actions. She thought she could get away with it, that she could come crawling back and everything would return to normal. But that wasn't going to happen. I began to quietly prepare. I reached out to a lawyer, started gathering my finances, and made sure all my personal affairs were in order. I wasn't going to let her destroy me, but I wasn't going to make this easy for her either. I had a plan, and it was going to be a good one. The next week, I took the first step. I made sure that Barbara had no idea I was doing this. I contacted some of my old colleagues from work, the ones she'd always been friendly with, and began telling them what had happened. I wasn't going to let her keep this quiet. I wasn't going to let her maintain the facade of the loving wife and loyal partner when she had been anything but that. I needed people to know the truth. I also reached out to her family. She had 2 sisters, both of whom were close to me. They had always seen me as a good man, a dependable husband to Barbara. I sent them a message, brief but direct. I think it's time you knew what's been going on. Barbara's been unfaithful. I'm done. I didn't want to be vindictive, but I wasn't going to sit in silence while she tried to play the victim. I was going to expose the lie she'd created. She needed to understand that her actions had consequences. She couldn't just break everything and expect it to go unnoticed. It wasn't long before the news spread. Her sisters reached out to her, shocked and furious. Her friends started asking questions. And soon, the people in her life began to confront her. Barbara tried to explain herself, of course, but no one was buying it anymore. Everyone was seeing her for what she really was. And as for me, I was watching it all unfold, calm and steady. I wasn't about to let her off the hook. This was the beginning of her downfall, and I wasn't going to stop it. Barbara tried everything she could to make me reconsider, and at first, I could see the frustration building behind her pleading eyes. She would come to me with tear-streaked cheeks, a shaky voice, and all the same excuses. She'd apologize for everything, blame her actions on stress, loneliness, or some vague emotional crisis. She even accused me of not paying enough attention to her over the years. The manipulation was so transparent, I could almost predict her every move. At first, I thought it would be easy. It felt almost too simple, telling her how much she had hurt me, showing her the door and walking away. But it wasn't like that. Not for someone like Barbara, who always had the power to turn on the charm when she needed it. I had to be smarter than that. My resolve had to be ironclad because I knew she wouldn't stop trying to win me back. And I knew that as long as she thought there was a chance for us, I wouldn't be free from her grasp. I had to show her that the world she built with lies was falling apart, piece by piece. I knew the key to all this was making her realize that her life wasn't the only one affected by her betrayal. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about our marriage. It was about everyone she had betrayed, including the people she thought she could rely on to cushion her fall. The first thing I did was leverage her own family. Over the course of our marriage, Barbara had always been very close to her parents. They were her foundation, her support system, and she liked to act like she could do no wrong in their eyes. But her actions were harder to justify once I started feeding them the truth. I didn't tell them everything outright, but I didn't need to. I planted seeds of doubt, subtly. I talked to her mother one evening, casually, as if I were just venting. "It's hard to trust someone who does this kind of thing, you know?" I said, shaking my head. Barbara's mom, who had always been so supportive of our marriage, didn't answer immediately. But I could see the change in her eyes, like a flicker of realization was passing through her. The more I made it clear that Barbara's infidelity wasn't an isolated mistake, the more her parents began to question her actions. One afternoon, while I was out with an old friend, I overheard Barbara speaking to her mother on the phone. It wasn't a full conversation, but I caught a few words here and there. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Please understand." I knew that her mother had finally begun to see her for who she was, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. I didn't want to destroy Barbara, but I wanted her to understand that everything she held dear was on the line. Her family wasn't going to back her up anymore. And that was only the beginning. Barbara's job was the next target. For all her talk about how much she loved me, I knew the thing that kept her up at night was her career. She was a senior marketing executive at a reputable firm, and her position was high enough that it was almost impossible to not notice the ripple effects if something went wrong. Her work was her pride. It was where she gained her validation. She lived for the praise she received from her bosses and colleagues. And I knew that if I could erode that, it would shake her to her core. I didn't want to just ruin her job. I wanted to make her realize that her choices had consequences that affected every part of her life. And no matter how high she climbed, the ground beneath her could always fall away. I didn't have to work too hard. I had a few old connections in her industry, people who weren't directly involved with her company, but who knew her work well enough. I made a few phone calls, dropped a few names in the right places. Slowly, rumors about Barbara began circulating in her industry. Nothing outright criminal or damaging, just enough to plant doubt about her integrity. A few well-placed whispers here and there about her personal life, especially the affair, made sure that when Barbara entered meetings or professional events, she wasn't greeted with the same enthusiasm. A colleague of hers, someone I had known for years, played a critical role in this. One night, over drinks, he casually mentioned to her boss that Barbara had been acting a little strange lately, like she's distracted. Of course, that wasn't the real reason she'd been distracted. It was because she'd been so busy lying and covering up the affair that her focus at work had begun to slip. But her boss didn't know that, not directly. He just noticed that Barbara wasn't the same person she used to be. She wasn't as sharp in meetings, didn't seem as committed to her work, and sometimes appeared tired. And that was the crack in the door. Barbara had no idea I was behind it. She still thought she was playing the role of the hurt, betrayed wife, while simultaneously managing her professional life as if nothing had changed. She didn't realize that her career was slipping through her fingers. When she finally came to me, asking what I was doing to her, I didn't flinch. I simply said, "Your choices have consequences, Barbara. You've already ruined everything at home. Don't be surprised if it spills over into the rest of your life." The isolation was perhaps the most devastating part. Barbara had always prided herself on being the center of attention. She was the one who organized family get-togethers, the one who always made sure people stayed in touch, who kept everyone updated. She had built an image of herself as a woman who had it all together. Happy marriage, successful career, a loving family. But all of that was shattered now. Once the whispers at work started, her friends couldn't help but notice the cracks in her facade. The first to back away was Claire, her best friend since college. Claire had always been loyal to Barbara, but when she found out the truth, through some subtle nudges from me, she stopped returning Barbara's calls. At first, Barbara tried to reach out. She sent Claire text messages, left voicemails, even sent a gift with a heartfelt note. But nothing worked. Slowly, other people who had once surrounded her started backing away too. Some of them began to question their own loyalty to her. I didn't need to do anything else. Barbara's own actions had pushed her friends and family into the corner. She couldn't hide her betrayal anymore, and they couldn't ignore the fact that she had ruined a man who had loved her for years. By the time Barbara realized how deeply she had alienated herself, it was too late. She had no one left to turn to. No friends to confide in, no family to help pick up the pieces. She was isolated, alone. When I finally served Barbara with divorce papers, it was clear that she was unraveling. The woman who had once stood tall, proud of her ability to keep everyone around her fooled, was now a shadow of herself. She tried to negotiate, offering me everything from alimony to promises of change, but I wasn't interested. This wasn't about money. It was about principle. She had broken something irreparably. There was no coming back from this. Barbara tried, of course. She sought therapy, hoping to use that as a way to make things right. She begged me to attend counseling sessions with her. She claimed she had changed and that she was willing to do the work to heal. But I wasn't interested in mending something that had already been destroyed. I didn't need her to fix herself for me. I needed her to understand that her actions had led us to this point, and there was no turning back. I made sure to control every part of the divorce process, every legal detail. I wasn't giving her a single thing she wanted. I was methodical, calm, and precise. Every meeting, every interaction was a reminder to her that her actions had consequences. She had lost her family, her career, and her social standing, all because of her choices. And as for me, I was free. Finally. In the months following Barbara's gradual unraveling, I had watched her descend deeper into desperation, clinging to the last remaining pieces of her once perfect life. She was no longer the confident, self-assured woman I had married. The truth was out there now. Everywhere she went, people whispered. At work, her reputation was stained. Her friends had distanced themselves. Her family was no longer as supportive, not when they understood the full extent of her betrayal. But I wasn't done yet. I knew that as long as Barbara thought she could turn things around, she'd keep trying. She'd keep up the act, keep pretending that somehow, if she could just convince me to forgive her, everything would go back to normal. But it wasn't going to. I had no intention of allowing her to sweep this under the rug. As the months passed, I slowly began to see the toll it was taking on her. The woman who had once prided herself on her appearance, her flawless makeup, carefully curated outfits, and impeccable hair, was fading. The spark in her eyes had dimmed. She was no longer vibrant, no longer in control. And that, to me, was the ultimate victory. She wasn't winning this game. I was. I watched as Barbara tried to piece together what was left of her life. And the more she fought to regain her footing, the more the truth seemed to swallow her whole. It wasn't just the personal and professional devastation. It was the realization that no matter what she did, nothing would ever be the same again. The final step in my plan, the one I had been working up to for months, was the most deliberate and public of all. I knew that if I wanted Barbara to truly understand the depth of her actions, I had to expose her to the people she cared about the most. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about showing her how little she could hide in the aftermath of the lies. It was Christmas Eve, of all nights, when I decided to take the final step. The holiday season had always been a time for family, for traditions, and for warmth. But to Barbara, it was just another opportunity to pretend that everything was fine. She'd invited me to her parents' house for dinner that night, hoping that some grand gesture of normalcy would help her reclaim some of the ground she had lost. I wasn't going to let that happen. Barbara had never known the full extent of my connections outside of our marriage. She thought I was just a quiet man who went about his business and didn't interfere in the lives of others. What she didn't know was that I had built a network over the years. People who respected me, people who would listen when I asked them to do something. So when I told a few trusted colleagues and mutual acquaintances about Barbara's affair and the damage it had caused, I made sure the news spread. It wasn't malicious. I didn't want her to be completely ostracized, but I wanted her to understand that people who had known us both for years could now see her for what she was. When Barbara walked into her parents' house that night, expecting a warm reception, she was met with something else entirely. Her mother, who had once showered her with unconditional love, gave her a cold stare as soon as she entered the room. Her father barely acknowledged her at all, and her younger brother, who had always been close to her, looked at her with pity. The air was thick with tension. Barbara, to her credit, tried to put on a brave face, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew something was off. What Barbara didn't know was that I had already sent a message to her father before dinner, telling him everything I had discovered. I hadn't gone into explicit detail, but I had given him enough to make him question his daughter's actions. She hadn't been the perfect angel they had always thought her to be. The moment her father looked at her with disappointment was all I needed to see. It was like a punch to the gut, and Barbara felt it deeply. The years of control, the image she had cultivated, it all started to crumble in that instant. I hadn't expected her to break down in front of everyone. I didn't want to humiliate her for the sake of it. But it was clear that Barbara couldn't handle the weight of her own guilt anymore. The tears started to well in her eyes as her mother pulled her aside into another room, whispering in her ear. The quiet murmurs reached me, and I could hear Barbara's voice crack as she tried to explain herself. But it was too late. The damage was done. By the time dinner ended, Barbara was a shell of the confident woman she had been just hours earlier. She made a half-hearted attempt at apologizing, but the words were hollow. I wasn't listening to her anymore. That evening marked the final end of our marriage. Barbara left her parents' house in tears, and I didn't follow her. I didn't offer comfort or even try to pretend that I cared anymore. In that moment, I knew there was nothing left to salvage. The betrayal, the lies, the hurt, it was all too much. For weeks after that night, Barbara tried to reach out. She sent me flowers, left me notes, and begged me to meet with her. But I was done. I had been done for months. The person I had once loved and trusted was gone. In her place was someone who had used me for her own selfish desires, without any regard for the man who had stood by her through thick and thin. The divorce proceedings were swift after that. I made sure that Barbara's actions were held up as the reason for the dissolution of our marriage. I wasn't looking for retribution in a cruel sense. I just wanted her to understand that I wasn't going to let her off the hook. She couldn't get away with hurting me and everyone else in her life without facing the consequences. But the real beauty of it all was that I didn't need to say much. I didn't need to be cruel or vindictive. I let Barbara's actions speak for themselves. Her friends, her colleagues, her family, they all saw the truth. And in the end, that was more than enough. I remember the last time Barbara reached out to me. It was almost 6 months after the divorce was final, and I received a letter from her in the mail. She poured out her soul in the letter, speaking about how sorry she was, how she had learned from her mistakes, and how she would do anything to make things right. She even promised to attend therapy and change her ways. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already moved on. I had already reclaimed my life. The final phase of my plan was more than just about securing my own peace. It was about making sure Barbara faced the full weight of her actions, so that she couldn't simply walk away from the destruction she'd caused. Her betrayal wasn't just a betrayal of me. It was a betrayal of everything we had built together, of the trust we had cultivated over the years. And I was determined to make sure she didn't just get to move on and pretend like none of it had happened. When we first started the divorce proceedings, Barbara's attempts to control the narrative had been expected. She tried to manipulate the situation, painting herself as the victim. She leaned on her friends and family, making them believe that I was the unreasonable one, the cold-hearted man who was punishing her for a mistake. But none of it worked. It couldn't work. I had prepared the ground long before we even started. I knew her weaknesses, knew where her reputation stood, and knew how she relied on appearances to sustain herself. That's why the slow, methodical unraveling of her life was so effective. It wasn't one single moment. It was a series of calculated steps. Every time Barbara tried to get back on her feet, I pushed her just enough to remind her of the consequences of her actions. And this time I was going for the final blow. As much as I hated to admit it, I'd been foolish at times in my marriage. I hadn't always kept an eye on the financials, trusting Barbara to take care of the household. But after the divorce, I made sure that I controlled every aspect of our joint finances. I wasn't going to let her walk away with anything she didn't deserve, not after everything she had done. It was around the time the divorce was finalizing that I noticed something strange. Barbara had started taking out large sums of money, which I could easily trace through joint accounts. She was withdrawing it under the guise of expenses, but I knew better. The amounts were too consistent, too planned. It wasn't just to pay off debts. No, this was something more deliberate. I couldn't help but wonder if Barbara was planning something. If she was preparing herself for some new relationship, trying to cover her tracks in case things came back to haunt her. And that's when it clicked. She had been saving money, keeping secrets, and moving in ways that I hadn't noticed before. I contacted my lawyer, a no-nonsense professional who had been with me through thick and thin. Together, we launched an investigation. We found that Barbara had been siphoning money out of our joint accounts for months, funneling it into hidden accounts under aliases, pretending it was for a business venture that never existed. The numbers were there, in black and white, evidence of her lies. The next step was critical. I made sure the court would have all of this information when it came time to finalize the divorce settlements. I had no intention of letting her walk away with anything, not after everything she had done. When Barbara was presented with the full financial records during the proceedings, the shock on her face was priceless. She had thought she could get away with hiding her secretive spending. She had no idea that I had been watching. The financial blow was important, but it wasn't the only thing I was working on. The real damage was always going to come from her social life. Barbara had always prided herself on her image. Her friends, her colleagues, her social circle. Those were the people who validated her sense of self-worth. And yet, They were the same people she had lied to, betrayed, and misled. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that exposing her for the fraud she truly was would be the ultimate payback. I was careful, patient, and methodical. I didn't just go public with her affair. That would have been too easy. Instead, I worked quietly behind the scenes, making sure the right people learned the truth. I knew that Barbara was still trying to maintain the illusion of control, that she still believed she could salvage her relationships with her closest friends. One by one, I subtly dropped hints, carefully crafted phone calls, discreet messages, into the ears of the people who mattered most to her. Her friends from yoga classes, her book club colleagues, and even some of her old college friends. I fed them just enough to make them start questioning her. Then, during one of her regular weekend trips to visit her parents, I made sure the news reached her circle of friends all at once. Barbara had no idea what was coming. One by one, I watched as her trusted confidants slowly cut ties with her, one friend at a time. At first it was small. Someone wouldn't return her calls. Another wouldn't accept an invitation to dinner. And then it happened all at once. At one dinner party, a longtime friend turned to Barbara with a cold, final look. "You've hurt too many people, Barb," she said, before leaving her stunned at the table. Barbara tried to fight it, but she was losing. Her phone calls became increasingly desperate, her apologies more and more frantic. She even tried to appeal to me, asking me to help her make amends with her friends, with the people she had wronged. But there was nothing left for me to fix. I had no interest in patching up her shattered world. I wasn't her savior. I wasn't her therapist. I was the man she had destroyed, and it was time for her to face the consequences. The final phase of my plan involved her career, the thing that had always been her backup, the thing that allowed her to continue living a double life without consequence. I knew that if I took away her professional reputation, she would have nothing left. But I wasn't going to just ruin it. I was going to expose her for who she really was. I would take everything she had worked for and show it to the world. I'd already made sure that her affair was well known in her workplace. It started with a subtle email to the right people, sharing just enough about her misdeeds. People who had worked alongside her, people she thought she had manipulated, started to turn on her. Her colleagues slowly stopped trusting her. The whispers started behind her back, first in private conversations, then in public forums. Barbara began to receive more and more warnings. She was on the verge of losing her position, and she knew it. She came to me, begging for help. "You know I can't lose this job," she said, her voice trembling. "I've worked too hard. Please don't ruin me like this." But it was too late. I'd already done enough. The damage had been done. I watched her lose her job a week later. Her employer couldn't turn a blind eye to the scandal that had enveloped her life. And just like that, the final thread of her carefully constructed world unraveled. Barbara was left with nothing, no career, no friends, no reputation. The life she had built on lies and deceit was gone. The truth finally settled into her bones, but it didn't come without its price. By the time Barbara came to me for one final time, begging for mercy, there was nothing left in her. She had nowhere to turn. She was broken, not just emotionally, but financially and socially. She knew she had no choice but to accept the consequences of her actions. "I'll do anything," she said through tears, her voice shaking with desperation. "Please just help me. I'll fix it. I'll make it right. I'll make things right between us." But I had already made my peace. I was done. The betrayal was too great, and her repentance too little, too late. Looking back, I still can't believe I did all that. It wasn't the man I ever thought I'd become. But then again, you don't realize who you are until you've been pushed to your breaking point. Maybe I was always that person. I just didn't know it. I'm no longer the naive, optimistic man who trusted blindly. What happened with Barbara changed me in ways I'm still coming to understand. I used to think I could forgive her. After all, I wasn't a vengeful man. I always believed in second chances. But this was different. The lies she told were not just about infidelity. They were about who I was to her, who we were to each other. The trust she shattered was the foundation of everything we had built. She didn't just cheat on me with another man. She cheated on me with a version of herself that didn't even exist. She had betrayed every moment we had shared together. So no, I couldn't just let it go. And I didn't. I'm sure some of you might wonder if it was worth it, if bringing her to ruin gave me any sense of satisfaction. The truth is it didn't. I didn't feel joy in her suffering. There was no victory in seeing her lose everything. All I felt was emptiness, like I'd spent so much time and energy tearing down a person I once loved. I forgot to think about what it was going to leave behind. The first few months after the divorce were quiet, almost painfully so. At first, I thought I would feel liberated, free from the constant tension, the lies, the hurt. But instead, I found myself staring at an empty house, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. I missed her, of course. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But that version of Barbara, the one I had loved, the one I had trusted, she didn't exist anymore. And in some ways, I guess I knew that deep down, I had been slowly losing her long before the affair came to light. I stayed busy. I worked on my garden. I spent more time with old friends. Slowly, my life started to fill up with things I had long ignored. I went back to reading more, even started writing again. For the first time in years, I found myself at peace, not because of anything that happened to her, but because of what I had managed to reclaim. My dignity, my peace of mind, and my ability to trust myself again. As for Barbara, I haven't heard much from her. I heard she moved out of the city, changed her number, and tried to rebuild her life. I don't know how much of it is true, but I don't care to find out. She's no longer a part of my world, and I'm fine with that. If you're reading this and wondering if revenge was the right thing to do, I can only tell you this. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about making sure someone who hurt you and took you for granted truly understood the cost of their actions. In the end, you have to ask yourself, what is the price of betrayal? And if you're lucky enough to survive it, you'll realize that the price is much higher than you ever thought. I've moved on, and I'm okay with that.